allows the Jews to go back to Palestine, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and to reestablish their society. And as we said in some of our early classes in this study, you essentially had three major population centers of Jews. You had the Jews who remained in Babylon, which was the majority of them, the Jews who had gone back to rebuild Jerusalem and resettle in Palestine, and then you had a population of Jews who had fled to Egypt in the time of Jeremiah after the Babylonian incursion, and there was a fairly sizable population of Jews there in Egypt. And so you had three major population centers, but our main focus in this study has been on the population of Jews who lived in Palestine. So as the Old Testament closes with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the prophets that go along with that time period, and Esther, because she falls into that time period as well, the Persians are dominating the scene and dominating the Jews. Now, Daniel the prophet had foretold that there would come a king who would overthrow the Persians. And sure enough, just as Daniel had foretold it in 333, Alexander the Great, who was the Macedonian or Greek king, general, comes in and overthrows the Persian Empire, and the Greeks begin to dominate the Jews. Alexander really only lives about 10 years after this, and then dies, and upon his death, a series of events begin that lead to the breaking up of this massive empire that Alexander had managed to conquer. And it breaks into essentially four main pieces, two of which concern our study. There was the section that was controlled by the Seleucids, which was most of the land area. And then there was the section that was controlled by the Ptolemies, which was Egypt, and Palestine by a fluke. And so for quite a bit of time, up until about 170 or so BCE, the Ptolemies of Egypt had control over Palestine, and they were pretty friendly overall to the Jews and let them pretty well take care of their own affairs as long as they paid taxes and didn't cause trouble and things like that. Well, about the 170s or so, Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III, who was a Seleucid king, came in and took over Palestine. And from that time until the Maccabean revolt, it was the Seleucids who dominated the Jews. We don't have time to go into all the details, but the Maccabean revolt begins around 167. By 164, and that's the reason I put an end date to the Greek domination, by 164 the Maccabeans had acquired control of the city of Jerusalem. And they had driven out the Seleucid armies, they had cleansed the temple from the pollutions that Antiochus IV had introduced, and they began to expand the, thank you, let's see if I can like that. My computer keeps going to sleep on me. As long as it's the only thing in this room going to sleep, we're okay. But the Jews had expelled the Seleucids from Jerusalem, and they began a campaign to control their own affairs. And so beginning about 164, they acquire some level of autonomy. You might even begin to say sovereignty. Now, nominally, they were still under Greek domination. But practically speaking, they were pretty well controlling their own affairs. And so this period that we've denominated the Hasmonean dynasty from 164 to 63 BCE is a period where you had Jewish rulers ruling Jews in Palestine. So we look at this Hasmonean dynasty, and I won't belabor this point, we've been going through this for some time, but it begins with Mattathias, who was the father of Judas Maccabeus, and his three of his five sons, in turn, serve in a role of what we might call ethnarch, leader of the people without a special title. They never called themselves kings at this time. Two of them assumed the role of high priest. Any of those that have the letter P by their name, if you can see that, that's the ones who claimed the role of high priest. Simon Thassi was the last of Mattathias' sons to have the role of ethnarch and high priest. And when he died, he was actually assassinated by his son-in-law, along with two of his other sons, Mattathias and Judas. The only one who survived was the son who was not present at the banquet where the others were assassinated, and that was John Hyrcanus the first. He takes over as high priest, and he rules for a time. Two of his sons rule in his stead when he dies, Aristobulus the first being the first of his sons to rule. And although his rule was very brief, he claimed for himself not only the title of high priest, but the title of king. And so you'll notice, beginning with Aristobulus, some of these have the letter K beside their name. That marks the ones who claimed the title of king. Aristobulus reigned a very short time, and then his brother Alexander Jannaeus ruled for a good long while, and married a woman named Alexandra Salome. When Alexander Jannaeus died, Alexandra Salome ruled in his stead. But one thing she could not do, she could not serve as high priest, because the law of Moses required a male to serve as high priest. And so she appointed her son, John Hyrcanus II, to serve as high priest. Now, Hyrcanus served as high priest throughout the entire rule of Alexandra Salome, but when she died, his brother began to wage war against him to take the role of king and high priest. Okay, so if we look at a timeline here, you'll notice right down here toward the end, we have Alexandra Salome ruling from 76 to 67, and we have the exact same years for John Hyrcanus II. That's because he was high priest during that period, but he was not king. Okay. As soon as she dies, Aristobulus takes over. He attacks his brother. As a matter of fact, Hyrcanus' soldiers, many of them defected and went to his brother's army, and so Aristobulus becomes king. He makes a deal with Hyrcanus that if Hyrcanus will retire from public life, he'll let him keep the revenues from being high priest, but he can't have the title of the duties. So he retires from public life, but Hyrcanus has got an advisor, and his advisor's name is Antipater the Idumean. We've talked about in previous classes that Idumean is a New Testament era term for the people that we know in the Old Testament as Edomites, or descendants of Esau. And so they're first cousins to the Israelites who descended from Jacob, remember, Esau's brother. Well, Antipater is in the ear of Hyrcanus all the time that he's essentially in exile, and he's saying to him, one, your brother's plotting to kill you at the first instance. Two, your brother has wrongfully deprived you of the high priesthood, and I can help you take it back. And so Antipater goes down to the Nabateans. The Nabateans were a group of nomadic Arabic-type people who lived in the desert to the south and east of Palestine. And he persuades them to join Hyrcanus' cause against his brother. All right, so now you've got a civil war going on between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. And that's sort of where we left off last time. So we see kind of the development of this major timeline. We're here in the Hasmonean dynasty right down to the end of it. The Hasmonean dynasty is going to be replaced by the Herodian dynasty. We mentioned this last week. Antipater, the advisor of Hyrcanus, the Idumean, is the father of Herod the Great. Herod the Great, of course, is on the throne when Jesus is born. And Herod the Great has three sons, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip the Tetrarch, that we read about in the New Testament, all three of them. You'll recall, for example, in the story of Jesus' birth, that in Matthew's account of it, the wise men come looking for Jesus, and Herod wants to know how to find him. Now, he feigns as if his purpose in finding him is to go and worship him, but in reality, he's going to try to remove him because Herod sees in this prophesied Messiah a rival for domination. And so God warns the wise men, and they don't go back to Herod and report the location of the baby Jesus. They leave a different way. And so Herod slaughters every child from the age of 2 and down in Bethlehem. But God warned Joseph to take Jesus and Mary down into Egypt. And they stay in Egypt until Herod dies. And then they start to come back. But Matthew makes a note that Archelaus, the son of Herod, was ruling in Judea in those days, and for fear of Archelaus, Joseph doesn't go back to Bethlehem. He goes back to Galilee, which is actually under the rule of Herod Antipas. And that's where Jesus grows up, in Galilee, which is actually where Joseph was from in the first place, according to Luke's account. But Jesus grows up in Nazareth of Galilee. All right, so we're talking about this timeline, and I've put beside the timeline some world events because we need a little bit of context to what's going on in the world at large, because it's going to affect us. Now, I have greatly simplified all the stuff that's going on in this period of time. I've tried to narrow it down just to the things that directly bear on the Jews. But if you notice in 146, Rome conquers Carthage and Greece. Carthage is the end of the Punic Wars that have been going on for years. Carthage, of course, is located on the northern coast of Africa. When Rome conquers Carthage, that says Rome now controls the western half of the Mediterranean Sea and everything that borders it. Okay? Now, the same year, Rome defeats the Greeks in Corinth and takes control of the Greek peninsula. That's huge. Because up until this point, Greece has been the dominant influence on the eastern part of the Mediterranean, where the Jews that we're looking at are concerned. Well, shortly thereafter, during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus from 87 to 63, you have the Mithridatic Wars. Aside from being a really big word for an Alabama boy, the Mithridatic Wars were a series of 3 wars that the Romans fought with the people who controlled Asia Minor. Now, what is Asia Minor? I should have put a map up here. That's Turkey today, okay? So, Rome wins the Mithridatic Wars in 63, which means that Rome now controls Asia Minor, or Turkey. Do you see what they're doing? They've taken control of the western half of the Mediterranean. They've taken control of Greece, which is the next thing east of Italy. Now they've taken control of Asia Minor, which is the next thing to the east of Greece, and they're moving toward Palestine. Their ultimate goal, of course, is to dominate everything that they can get their hands on. That's what they're after. Now, 63, there was a very famous general for the Romans who was the victor in the Mithridatic Wars. His name was Pompey the Great. Pompey had a mandate from the Roman Senate that lasted for 3 years. And he had special powers, military powers, that he was allowed to exercise during those 3 years. It only took him a few months to win the Mithridatic Wars, and he wasn't about to let the remainder of those 3 years go to waste. And so he goes to work trying to conquer the old Seleucid kingdom. Now that's a smart move on his part for a couple of reasons. Number one, of course, it extends Roman control farther east and toward Mesopotamia, which opens up trade routes, which opens up all kinds of commerce, which opens up, of course, all kinds of control for Rome, tax revenue, you name it. But the Seleucids are an especially strategic choice because they've been infighting for about 3 generations now. And in terms of political will, they don't have any. They're all broken up into different little warring factions, and it'd be pretty easy to divide and conquer, and sure enough, that's essentially what Pompey does. Well, in doing that, of course, now he's controlling everything to the north and east of Palestine. Guess what's next on his list? Well, traditionally speaking, if we go back and look at history, once you begin to control Mesopotamia, the next thing is Egypt. And Egypt's already flourishing under Greek rule. Alexandria is probably the most advanced city in the world at that time. And so surely that's in the crosshairs of the Romans. Well, that brings Pompey into contact with these two brothers, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, who are having a civil war to decide who gets to control the Jews. Both of them appeal to Pompey to support them against the other. Pompey says, well, first of all, Pompey's general says, we're going to support Aristobulus. Pompey says, I want to wait to make a decision until I arrive in Judea myself. Aristobulus takes this as a bad sign, and he goes and holes up in his fortress, preparing to be, attacked. And Pompey says, So that's what he's going to do. He's going to resist me. And that sort of makes up his mind that now he's going to support Hyrcanus. Now that's an especially good move for Pompey because, as we mentioned last week, the history writers are unanimous in that they all say Hyrcanus was extremely weak-willed and easily controlled. As a matter of fact, most all of them who write about him pretty well forthrightly say that Antipater was playing him like a puppet. And surely Pompey, who is a really intelligent leader, picks up on this and says, if I put that man in charge, he's not going to rebel. I can pretty well control what he'll do. Now, Aristobulus over here, maybe not so much. And so Aristobulus is holed up in his fortress. Pompey just simply marches his soldiers down in front of the fortress, and Aristobulus says, I give up. Out he walks and surrenders. Well, Pompey decides that next he's going to go and take the city of Jerusalem. Most of Aristobulus' supporters are holed up in Jerusalem, and they won't let Pompey in. Matter of fact, okay, all right, there we go. They lock the gates up. And they say, you're not getting entrance into here. Probably called him a few not so nice names since he was an uncircumcised Gentile and all of those sorts of things. And that incensed him. He still had Aristobulus in his reach. And so the first thing he does is to arrest Aristobulus. And the second thing he does is to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem may be controlled by Aristobulus' followers, but not everyone in Jerusalem is one of Aristobulus' followers. Hyrcanus has his own followers. And some of Hyrcanus' followers let Pompey and his soldiers into a gate in the northwestern part of the city. And so in come the Romans. Aristobulus' followers hole up in the temple compound, and they take refuge there. And so Pompey's soldiers come into the city, and they lay siege within the city around the temple compound. Well, you know how a siege works. Essentially, you cut off all the supplies in or out, and pretty soon you starve out the people that are in there, and the siege works. And not only that, while they're besieging the temple compound, Pompey has his soldiers building an earthwork that just simply allows them to walk over the wall and right into the compound, and that's what they do. They walk over the wall into the compound to the weakened forces of Aristobulus, who've been besieged for a few months now, and they take the temple. And Pompey does something that does not endear him to the Jews at all. He walks into the temple all the way into the Holy of Holies. Now go back and think about your Old Testament. Who was allowed in the Holy of Holies? Only the high priest. And could he go in there anytime he wanted? Absolutely not. When could he go? Only on the Day of Atonement, right? And only then after he had performed a series of rituals and gone through the steps that God had outlined for him. The idea of walking into the Holy of Holies was the same. It was tantamount in the mind of the Jews and under the Old Testament regime to barging into the presence of God and demanding an audience. Now, if God had willed, surely he could have struck Pompey dead on the spot. He had done such for less in the past. But Pompey walks into the Holy of Holies and defiles it. he's not foolish enough to do what Antiochus IV had done and set up idols in the Holy of Holies or offer to the idols in the temple. He has a little bit more, I don't know what you'd say, sensitivity than that. He simply turns around, walks back out, and instructs the priests to cleanse the Holy of Holies, cleanse the temple, and pick back up with the practice of their religion. So he doesn't cause any further offense than that. But 63, the siege of Jerusalem, marks really the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. Because when Pompey leaves, he takes Aristobulus and his families as prisoners back to Rome. He places Hyrcanus in the role of high priest and ethnarch with no political power. And he goes back to Rome. Okay? So now Hyrcanus is back in control. Except Hyrcanus has never been in control in the first place, except in name only, right? And the administrative duties are being done behind the scenes by Antipater. Antipater is the one who's directing the collecting of taxes. Antipater is the one who's handling the dealings with Rome. Antipater is handling everything in the name of Hyrcanus. Now, about this time, there breaks out a Roman civil war. Now, the historians in here are going to shout, eek, there's no way there are only 3 Roman civil wars. There's something closer to, I don't know, 26, 30, something like that. I realize that. I'm just listing the ones that directly impact our story, okay? The first Roman civil war in 49 to 45 is between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Pompey has essentially established his power in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar's is primarily in the western. These egos are too big to coexist for long. They do for a while, they're allies for a while, but eventually they turned on each other and they fought. And who won? Julius Caesar wins. Ends up naming himself dictator for life, right? Well, initially Antipater supported Pompey. Of course he did. Pompey was the one that had put the administration he was a member of in power. However, when the tides begin to turn and Caesar begins to win, Antipater switches sides. And Caesar defeats Pompey, but he goes down to Egypt and he finds himself besieged in Egypt by the Egyptian forces. Julius does. Okay? So Antipater gets together with Mithridates. The Mithridatic Wars, they're named after Mithridates, who was the king of Pontus in the center of Asia Minor. He makes an alliance with Mithridates, and they get 30,000 soldiers and go to the rescue of Julius Caesar and break him free of the siege. Now, what do you suppose Julius thought about that?
Gave him an attaboy.
Yeah, a big attaboy. First thing he did was to name Antipater a Roman citizen. He wasn't. He was an idiot. He names him a Roman citizen. Second thing he does is to exempt him from taxes for life. Then he showers him with honors and praise, and he names him the procurator of Judea. That means now Antipater is not operating in the shadows anymore. He has official authority. And so he goes back to Jerusalem, and the Jews don't like this a little bit. He's not a Jew. He's an Idumean. And they don't want to be under the rule of anybody that's not a Jew. They've had about 100 years of semi-autonomy, semi-self-rule. And the last thing they want is to go back under the domination of some foreigner. So they begin to raise problems, and he lets the word out and says, look, I can be a gentle leader, or I can be a tyrant. Your pick. They decided not to test him on that. And so Antipater is essentially in control. Now, while Antipater is in control, we have the second Roman Civil War. Julius Caesar names himself dictator for life in about 44. That lasts all of a few months until what happens, remember?
Yeah, March 15th.
Cassius leads the Senate in assassinating Caesar, and as Shakespeare pictures it for us, Brutus makes a speech and says, It's not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. Caesar was ambitious. And Mark Antony, in Shakespeare's words, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And he essentially says, Brutus said Caesar was ambitious. Oh, really? What about when he cried for the death of your loved ones? What about when he provided for the poor? What about when he helped out the sick? Was that ambitious? And he wins the hearts of the Roman people. So a civil war starts. On one side of it, you have Octavian, who's the grandnephew, actually, of Julius Caesar, but he's his heir, and Mark Antony. On the other side, you have Brutus and Cassius. So you have the Caesarians and the liberators. And you have a civil war over that. Now, Antipater catches himself on the wrong side of this. And the reason he's on the wrong side of it is not of his own making, but Cassius, in the meantime, has come to control Syria. And Antipater answers to Syria because Syria answers to Rome. And so Antipater is sort of in a position where he has to support Cassius. But as soon as Cassius and Brutus lose, Antipater begins to butter up Octavian. You see what he is? He's a consummate politician, and a pretty good one as far as that goes. So he begins to solidify his power. So we've got this Roman domination. Antipater's exercising administrative functions, as we said, first unofficially, and then after he rescues Caesar in the name of procurator. He has his sons, Phasael and Herod, named governors of Jerusalem and Galilee. Herod was first the governor of Galilee. And then in 43, right about the time all this is going on, he gets poisoned. The man who poisoned him, there's an interesting story that I don't have time to tell now, but the gist of it was the Jews really didn't like him and didn't trust him. And this man hated him, even though, interestingly enough, Antipater saved this guy's life about 3 different times. And this guy still hated him and managed to get one of his butlers to poison his wine, and he died in 43. Well, he dies in 43, and that leads to Antigonus. Antigonus is the son of Aristobulus. He had been carried off to Rome with his dad when Pompey carried his dad off as a prisoner after the siege of Jerusalem. He escapes and comes back in 57. And he tries to rouse up a rebellion several times. But what he ends up doing is, after the death of Antipater, he allies with the Parthians, and he gets some support among the aristocracy and the Pharisees. He comes in, he conquers Jerusalem, and he takes his uncle Hyrcanus and he mutilates his ears. Why would you mutilate his ears? I should make you wait till next week to find out. I'm not going to do it. Remember the law of Moses said, among other things, that a priest could not serve who had physical defects or mutilations? By mutilating Hyrcanus' ears, he forever disqualified him to ever serve as high priest again and sent him off to Babylon. So he effectively removed a threat to his power without killing him. Okay. Mutilates his ears, and he takes on the role of king and high priest. Now that doesn't last very long, because Herod, the son of Antipater, flees to Rome. Mark Antony takes him before the Senate, and the Senate says, we're going to name you the new king of the Roman province of Judea, and we're going to give you all the support of the Roman Empire. And he goes back to Judea, lays siege to the city of Jerusalem, takes Antigonus, and has him carried up to Antioch. Now, it depends on which historian you read as to what happens next. All of them agree that Mark Antony killed Antigonus. I believe it is, well, I'm not going to say because I'll say it wrong. One of the historians, I've forgotten which one, says that he was crucified. The others all say he was beheaded. I know Josephus was one that said he was beheaded. But at any rate, Mark Antony is directly responsible for the death of Antigonus. Why is that important? That's the end of the Hasmoneans. He's the last. There's no more Hasmonean rule. And with that, now we're back here, and I'll close on that note if I can flip my board over. We're back here with the Herodian dynasty in control. And that's where we pick up in the New Testament with Herod the Great on the throne when Jesus is born. That pretty well concludes the period of history that I wanted us to study together. However, there's been a request that we take a little bit of a deep dive into the development of the Pharisees and Sadducees so that we kind of know who these people are and where they come from when we meet them in the New Testament. So for the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at that. And then I have a new subject that I think we're going to go into probably beginning in January. Thank you so much for your attention.